Hey everybody, welcome to Active Self-Protection Extra. Today I want to rustle your jimmies just a little bit. And I want to talk about, are there 4 rules of safe firearms handling? Are there 3 rules of safe firearms handling? How should we articulate those? And what does that mean for you and me?
Now Throom. Throom targets are lightweight, weatherproof, take thousands of rounds of shooting and make shooting fun. Pick up a set for your next range trip.
All right, you guys know that sometimes I'm gonna come on the channel and I'm always full of opinions, right? And that's what I do. I mean, this is my life, is as a master firearms instructor, I wanna help people do the best that they can in defensive gun use and in real world defensive gun uses. That's why we have the big channel. This channel, of course, our training channel for our skill set. So I wanna talk about Colonel Cooper's 4 rules, why I personally am not a huge fan of how they're articulated, or the NRA's 3 rules, and I think they're better, but we adjusted a few things, and this is why when we talk about this, and I started a Donnybrook the other day on Instagram and Facebook on the company pages because of these, but this is why I articulate them the way I do, so let me explain why. Also, I have in here for you the 4 rules as Colonel Cooper said them, as Colonel Cooper articulated them. Now, they've been kind of adjusted a little bit. If you go to Gunsight today, and I'm a Gunsight fan, I'm a Gunsight alumnus. We have been before, I've taken Gunsight Pistol 250 there. I'm actually looking forward to another class there. Just got to put it in the schedule and find the money. And I consider the CEO, Ken Campbell, a strong acquaintance. Freddie Blish, who's an instructor there, is a man I respect very highly. Guy, he owned Robar Customs handguns for quite some time. And so I'm not beefing with the Colonel, okay? I do, and I get it. These are what they teach in the Marine Corps. Why? I mean, maybe because Colonel Cooper was a colonel. I don't know, maybe he's a guy who started American defensive pistol training. And so we owe him a great debt of gratitude. I'm gonna put a link in the description to the Colonel actually explaining them. We actually have him on video explaining the 4 rules. So when I say this one here, when I say all guns are always loaded, I know there's gonna be some blowback that says, well, we always treat firearms as if they are loaded. In fact, the first thing that he says in his class on this that I've linked in the description is that he hates that articulation, that that's not cool. Is that no, we assume all guns are always loaded. Now you're gonna see him in that video do dry fire with a gun. So I don't think he always treats all guns like they're loaded. What he's really saying there is that you always assume that a gun is loaded. You never assume that a gun is unloaded unless it's in your hand. You've personally verified yourself that it is unloaded. Then you can do your dry practice or those kinds of things. But I got a couple of challenges with the way this is. So when we say all guns are always loaded, no, they're not. So again, we say, well, always treat a firearm as if it's loaded. No, we don't. We don't. If we look over here, I have my dry fire stuff here. And if I always treated a firearm as if it was loaded, I would never do this because I don't actually want to put holes in things. And if I did actually treat every firearm as if it was loaded, I'd never do dry fire. Now, when we say, wait a minute, the other thing is that what does this mean in terms of what am I supposed to do? All guns are always loaded. So what do I do with that? What am I being asked to do? Now I have to have a sub list of rules that, okay, always make sure that your firearm is unloaded when you pick it up, and make sure and check it yourself. And whenever you put it in a holster, take it out of the holster, whenever you are going to pick it up off the deck or any of those things. And then we always treat firearms with the utmost respect. So those are all things that we are going to do from that. But this rule itself actually doesn't really tell us anything. Really doesn't. Now, next thing, never let the muzzle cover anything you are unwilling or not willing, depending on when he articulated it, to destroy. I don't really have any challenge with this articulation of the rule, except for never let tells me what not to do. It doesn't say what to do, it says what not to do. And what we see in officer-involved incidents, if you're watching the big badge cams, you see this all the time. Don't touch the knife. And as soon as you say to somebody, don't touch the knife, what do they do? They go for the knife. When you say, hey man, don't put your hands in your pockets, they instantly start to put their hands in their pockets because all they hear is put hands pockets, and especially under stress. So when I give negative commands, don't do this thing, that doesn't work in the human psyche, especially under stress, nearly as well as a positive command. Now that said, hey, this is basically saying don't point guns at things that you are unwilling to shoot, right? Like don't point guns at things that the consequences are too high if a bullet goes through them. So I don't mind that. Now, number 3, my same challenge, keep your finger off the trigger until your sights are on the target. Go watch Colonel Cooper's articulation of this. Again, I'm not picking on the Colonel. I think that if he was today, he would maybe think through some of these things just a little bit more. But again, I am telling you what not to do. Keep off. right? Don't do this. But I'm not telling you where to do that. So again, I have a firearm here, not a firearm, this is a blue gun, right? So it's a training replica. And again, if I keep my finger off the trigger, we talk about this all the time, that what we've grown for quite a while is that if my finger is off the trigger yet in front of the trigger guard, we have this interlimb callation, this sympathetic squeeze between hands. If I grab something here, then my finger's here and I can have an inadvertent discharge, a negligent discharge when I do that. We've seen it on camera. We've seen badge cams of it several times of it happening. So again, this is, I think, in a modern context, insufficient. I need to be more than off the trigger. And the other thing he says, until your sights are on the target. Now, I think in a modern context, we might articulate that a little bit more. What the colonel meant by that is if we are here at a guard position, he would say, okay, so my safety is on and my finger is off the trigger until I come up, safety off on the trigger, and I'm ready to fire, so that my finger's on the trigger even if I am not firing. So he would say, wait a minute, when I come up, the finger goes on the trigger until and can stay there until such time as I choose to fire, but I can have my finger sitting on the trigger while I'm not firing, and that's okay as long as I see my front sight. And he literally says in that video that as soon as I see my front sight, my finger goes on the trigger. As soon as I don't see my front sight, my finger comes off the trigger, and that's his standard. Well, I think a couple of things with that. Number one, there'll be times where I might actually have my sights up and on target and yet not be ready to fire, and I don't want my finger on the trigger in case I had a startle response. And if I have a startle response, I could have a negligent discharge when I don't want to, so we wouldn't generally do that. Second thing here, we actually also teach, at times, we teach a firing position for a close contact, somebody that's inside of 2 arms lengths, that we wouldn't jump out and see our sights on the target, that we would actually shoot from here. Now, most folks would say, well, wait a minute, the sights are on the target, but of course the colonel meant if I can't see my front sight, then I can't be on the trigger. He didn't really consider that retention shooting, you know, that thumb pectoral index that Craig Douglas likes to talk about, or that retention shooting and two-handed retention shooting that we talk about all the time as well. So not sure of that. Number 4 is an interesting articulation. Always be sure of your target. And I like this. So this idea of number 4 was that you can't shoot at sounds, is really what he was saying. Hey, you can't shoot at rustling, you can't shoot at the dark, you have to know what it is you're shooting. Now, what we see in a modern context is they say, wait a minute, be sure of your target, what is around it, what lies beyond it, so that you're really kind of seeing what's going on in your world. I get it, and I think that is not a bad thing. Again, but I do think we can articulate it better, and I think that, again, this is a good one, but I think we can articulate it better. So this is the Colonel Cooper's rules. And at the end of the day, if I don't point a firearm at somebody, it's not loaded, and the firearm is, and I don't press the trigger, well, then the gun won't go off, right? So 3 things that I have to do in order to have a negligent discharge that harms somebody is that I have to have a loaded gun, I have to press the trigger on that loaded gun unless I have a mechanical fault, and I have to have the firearm pointed at somebody. Doesn't need a firearm pointed at them. So that in mind, I think that the NRA's rules of safe firearms handling highlight that, okay? I like a couple things about it. 3 always, 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 always. I like that. That to me is simpler. So in adult learning and the way that we think about things, I like the way that this is articulated a little bit better. Always keep the gun pointed in a safe direction is the NRA's rule of things. Now, of course, I have to then define what's a safe direction. Now, there are some problems here because sometimes we say, wait a minute, is something safe or unsafe? So that leads us to binary thinking. And it's not my favorite, but I think it's pretty okay. I also think that it's Cooper's rule number 2, right? So it's the same thing. Rule number 2 here is at least they're kind of the same. This is worded negatively, this is worded positively. But of course, I have to decide that. I also think there are some things that we go, is that a safe direction or is it not a safe direction? Well, then we got to define terms somewhere. And number 2, always keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. That's, I think, pretty much the same. Keep your finger off the trigger until your sights are on the target. I think that's kind of the same. I think this one's a little better because, again, I might be on the target but not ready to shoot yet. And so until I'm ready to shoot, I'd keep my finger off the trigger. I will say that some folks will take that in a way that I don't think is best, that they'll have the gun out and in hand. This, well, I'm ready to shoot, but I'm not on my sights, so I can have my finger on the trigger. Nah, we'd really rather you not. And then there's number 3 is the one that causes the most consternation for most people. Always keep the gun unloaded until ready to use. Now, in the NRA's rules, I think some people think, oh, that just means it's just for the range, that you bring guns to the range unloaded, of course, and then you load them when you're going to go target shoot, you unload them and put them in the box, and this means that these are range rules and not life rules. actually disagree here. And I'm going to argue that I word it just a little bit different here. But I think that this is a rule for life. Firearms that are stored should be unloaded all the time. Now, a gun that is on your person for personal protection, right? You're carrying a CCW gun. This is, again, it's a blue gun. But you're carrying a gun for protection. That firearm's in use is being used to protect your person, so it should be loaded, right? So by that rule number 3, absolutely. Now, if I take that gun off at the end of the day and store it for use, for not use, or if I'm a law enforcement officer, I take my duty belt off at the end of the day and that gun is no longer in use to protect my person, it's no longer in use and should be unloaded. It's simple as that. Now, of course, if you're going to continue to use it for home defense or something like that, of course, we'd suggest you put it in a quick access safe or something that keeps it from unauthorized access. But that's still in use. Now, long guns, we generally recommend that we keep long guns in a cruiser-ready condition. We'll talk about that another day. We've talked about it in other stuff. But guns that are not in use, are not ready to use, should be unloaded. And I think that that's a good rule of safe firearms handling. And then, now this is the thing, every time I pick a firearm up, I go, well, now it's unloaded, right? So I can do other things. No, still have to follow the other rules. So when I pick a firearm up, I check all 3 conditions, right? So I check, is the gun pointed in a safe direction? We'll talk about that in a minute. Number 2, make sure my finger is high and off the trigger because I haven't made a decision to shoot. And number 3, it's not being used if I'm just picking it up to inspect it. So I make sure it's unloaded. So I like those. I think that there are good rules. Now, I do think there's a better way to articulate some of them, though I think that whoever it is at the NRA who made this, and I don't know who it was, I think it's pretty good. I actually like this better than here. I think it's a more modern articulation. It's 3 simple positive commands, and I like that. Now, a couple things. What's the safe direction? What is ready to shoot? What do we mean off the trigger? And again, what does ready to use mean? So we've just kind of articulated them a little bit different to try to be more descriptive and give people a better idea of what they're looking at. So the way that we articulate them at Aspen, if you ever come to an ASP class, this is the way I articulate them. Number 1, always keep firearms pointed in the direction of least consequence. Now, as opposed to this one that is binary thinking, safe, unsafe, unsafe, this says there's always a consequence. If we had a negligent discharge, even if I'm something like, okay, this is my dry fire dojo, there are books in here, okay? But if I put a hole in this and I put a hole through this cabinet and into those books, it still has a consequence. It still is a big hole in my cabinet. It's still, you know, a huge noise and all the sound and all that stuff for me. It still is a crime in the state of Arizona where I live, so it has consequence. But that's certainly less of a consequence than if I pointed it in a direction where it goes into my master bedroom where my wife is. Get my point? So we like this idea of a least consequence, and we say that a least consequence is defined by a couple of things. Number 1, it is defined by no person gets a firearm pointed at him who does not need a firearm pointed at him, right? So the least consequence direction to point a gun is somebody who's an imminent deadly threat to you and yours. Point a gun at him. Other than that, though, then we always say that that is a very high consequence direction because human beings have inestimable worth, value, and dignity given to them by God, or you could call that their natural state of being or whatever if you don't believe in God. So again, pointed in the direction of least consequence, recognizing there is a consequence. So whenever I get a gun in my hand, I ask the question, wait a minute, where's the least consequence in this room? Because I might say in some cases it could be up. Now, of course, you're gonna go, wait a minute, John, then it goes up, goes through your ceiling, through the roof, comes down somewhere, and I don't know. So you're right, so often that's not a direction of least consequence. If instead I kind of pointed that in a guard position or something like that, is it gonna go through the floor? Is it gonna go into that room or whatever? I really like here because it's filled with books. And so that is generally a very low consequence direction. It's filled with books that I got a goodwill for nothing and don't care about. So that's generally a least consequence direction. Directly underneath us, especially you know, when I have real firearms in my hand, is my garage. And so I go, I mean, if I put a bullet hole in my truck or in my wife's minivan, I wouldn't love that. It's less of a consequence than if I pointed it that way with a real firearm where my children's bedrooms are. So I start thinking through what is the direction of least consequence. Always keeps me aware of what that is, and that is so contextually determined. If I had small children in the room, the high position, temple index, something like that might make a lot of sense. But in many locations, when I'm at the range, of course, keeping the firearm pointed towards the berm is almost always the safest direction, the direction of least consequence. So again, direction of least consequence. Number 2, we talk about keep your trigger finger high and in register until you consciously decide to fire. So what that means is when we say high and in register, now a register here has to be away from the trigger guard. A register is either on the frame of the gun or even better on metal if you have the finger flexibility, right? So for you right-handers, man, I love for right-handers, I love telling you, use that ejector port. That's a great place if you have the finger flexibility and size to do so. We had a student in class this weekend who had really short fingers. He couldn't reach it if he wanted to. Or other people, they have arthritic hands, they can't reach that high. If you can there, for us lefties, high like this, high and in register. In register means I know where it is, it's in a positive place that it is resting. It's not just dangling out in space, it's in register until I make the conscious decision to shoot. So even in Colonel Cooper's rules, if I get the gun up and I have it pointed at someone and I can see my front sight, if I've not made a conscious decision to shoot yet, I keep my finger high and in register until I go, yep, gotta shoot them. And now then we put our finger on the trigger. And then number 3, I always encourage people to always keep your firearms unloaded, not until you're ready to use them, but till they're actually in use. And so again, when I say, hey, this firearm is going to defend my person today, I take that firearm at that moment. This firearm is now in use defending my person. Now it should be loaded and holstered safely. If it's not in use, I just worry that sometimes what'll happen is that people will say, well, I'm ready to use it. So I'm at the range, I'm ready to use this gun. I'm not actually using it right now, but I'm ready to, so I will load it and put it on the table. Not so good, right? Until I'm actually, okay, this is the gun that I am now using to shoot that target. Now I load that gun, do my target shooting, unload the gun when I go to set it down on the bench. Again, defensive firearms should be loaded because they are being used, they are in use in defending. Doesn't mean you're actively shooting it, you are using it to defend those. So I think that's the best way to do that. Now let me wrap this up. I don't care which one you want to do. I think at the end of the day, they kind of do the same thing, right? So at the end of the day, direction of least consequence, we say, hey, we don't want our muzzle to cover anything we're unwilling to destroy, and we want to be sure of our target. We don't want to point guns at anything that don't need guns pointed at them. So I think it's 2 rules for Cooper, 1 rule for the NRA, a little better explained, better worded, in my opinion, through what we've done with active self-protection. Number 2, all guns are always loaded. I don't like this one. But at the same time, I think that at its core, what does it teach us in a modern time? It teaches us to treat firearms with respect and to not treat firearms flippantly and to do the things that we should do with them. It doesn't tell us exactly what to do with them. I think that we have to have other rules to do that. So I get it, but I think that they're encompassed in all of the rules that we say, hey, wait a minute, we always are treating firearms in the same manner. So I don't necessarily like that. Finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Finger off the trigger until you've made high and in register. Until you consciously decide to shoot, right? Finger off the trigger until your sights are on the target. Better or worse articulations of how all those go. Of course, I'm gonna tell you I like mine best, right? I think the Cooper's is probably has the most historical wear on it. The NRA's is okay. I think that a conscious decision to fire is what's required before you put your finger on the trigger. And again, as opposed to all guns are always loaded. And here's the thing, you know, when they say, well, always treat guns like they're loaded. No, Colonel Cooper was like, no, all guns are always loaded all the time. And I know people who have actually taken that, Marines who have taken that, who I respect highly, who they keep all their guns in their safe loaded because Colonel Cooper said all guns are always loaded all the time. So I may as well have them loaded all the time because that's how we treat them. I hate that. I think that's a really bad idea. And so I'd much rather go these ones here. But again, at the end of the day, I love what Carl Wren says about this, is that are there really only 2 rules? Keep firearms pointed in a safe direction. Don't press the trigger until you've made a conscious decision to fire that gun. Okay, I think, you know, always loaded or unloaded until they're in use or ready to use. I think this one is far better. So let's start a brouhaha, shall we? Which articulation of the rules is your favorite and why? Let's talk about it in the comments. Let's be respectful in the comments. And as always, don't forget to tell me I'm pretty.